Samuel Beckett's life often feels like an unwritten preface to Waiting for Godot, as if he had been rehearsing that long, anxious wait all his life. Born in 1906 just outside Dublin, into a Protestant middle class family, in a country that was predominantly Catholic, he grew up slightly off center in his own culture. From the beginning, he lived at the margins, inside Irish society, but not quite at its center, neither fully belonging nor entirely excluded. That built in sense of estrangement is important if we want to understand the kind of characters he later creates. This in between position is exactly where Vladimir and Estragon stand. They are not quite excluded, not quite included, simply waiting at the edge of the road that seems to lead nowhere in particular. They are not heroic outcasts, but they are not stable citizens either. They exist in a kind of a social and spiritual borderland. Beckett's own experience of being slightly out of place, religiously, culturally, and later linguistically, quietly shapes this dramatic world of permanent and uneasy waiting. As a student at Trinity College Dublin, Beckett immersed himself in French and Italian. This gave him direct access to European literature and philosophy, studying Dante and the long philosophical tradition that runs from Descartes to the existential thinkers of the modern era. Dante's Divine Comedy, for instance, offers us wanderers between worlds, especially in purgatory, where souls are neither fully damned nor fully saved, but suspended in a state of waiting. That image of souls in between strongly resonates with Vladimir and Estragon's strange limbo on stage. So, if we look at Waiting for Godot through this perspective, then the nowhere kind of setting of the play begins to feel less like a random roadside and more like a kind of purgatory, a space of waiting and suspension rather than a realistic location. Time seems to pass, but nothing really changes. They talk about leaving, yet they remain rooted to the spot. This is not just a geographical nowhere that we are talking about, it is a spiritual and existential middle ground, very much in line with the purgatorial imagination that Beckett probably absorbed from Dante and the European thought. Beckett is therefore not simply writing a quirky little play about two trams. He is drawing on the whole modernist crisis that we see in other writers as well. For instance, Eliot and Kafka, the loss of stable meaning, the breakdown of clear narratives, the sense of living after some unnamed catastrophe. But instead of expressing this crisis in a dense, elusive language, Beckett chooses the simplest, almost childlike speech. The tension between profound despair and very plain words is one of the reasons why Waiting for Godot feels so haunting. When we look at writers such as Eliot, we find that their poems are crowded with quotations and explicit references. We can see the footnotes, the fragments of other texts piled up in The Wasteland, for instance. Beckett, by contrast, strips his drama down to a bare minimum. He leaves what we might call ghostly traces of all of his readings. Dante, the Bible, philosophy, but he rarely names anything directly. Instead of overt quotation, in Beckett we get sparse, repetitive lines that carry an indivisible weight of tradition behind them. That is why the language of Waiting for Godot can sound so simple on the surface, yet feel so rich and unsettling when we listen closely and read closely. A major turning point in Beckett's life came when he moved to Paris after college. There he met James Joyce and became one of his most devoted assistants and admirers. Beckett worked closely with Joyce while Finnegan's Wake was being written, often reading to him and taking dictation because Joyce's eyesight was failing. There's this well known anecdote that while Beckett was taking down Joyce's words, someone knocked at the door. Beckett said, "Come in," instinctively, and when he read that passage back later, he found out that Joyce had decided to keep that come in into his text. That small accident shows us the extreme openness and density of Joyce's language, where anything can be absorbed into the work. But In Beckett, we see that he later chooses to go in the exact opposite direction, not towards complexity, but towards radical simplicity. Furthermore, Beckett's personal life also contained moments that echo the strange, indifferent universe that we find in Waiting for Godot. For instance, walking home in Paris one night, Beckett was stabbed by a stranger, reportedly a pimp, and nearly died. When the case went to court and Beckett asked the attacker, "Why did you do it?" the man reportedly said, "I don't know." There was no motive, no explanation, no clear cause and effect. This is very close to the moral atmosphere of Beckett's plays. Things happen, people suffer, and there is no satisfying reason given. This senseless, motiveless violence echoes in Pozzo's brutal treatment of Lucky and in the arbitrary beatings the boy reports from Mr. Godot. Like Kafka's worlds, Beckett's stage is ruled by forces that act without explanation, and this biographical moment gives us a glimpse of why the universe of Godot feels so indifferent, so irrational, and yet grimly recognizable. World War II intensified Beckett's confrontation with absurdity and endurance. He joined the French resistance in Paris, working in a clandestine network, passing coded messages at great personal risk. When his cell was betrayed, he and his partner Suzanne had to flee to the southern part of France, which was unoccupied at the time. They lived there under constant threat, working in vineyards and waiting, literally for news, for liberation, or for arrest. They were simply in a state of endless waiting. This experience of dangerous waiting, speaking in a kind of a code, and just waiting endlessly for instructions or salvation that may never arrive, of living between action and paralysis is crucial. Waiting for Godot, which was written just after these years, universalizes that experience of anxious waiting so that it speaks not only to a war generation but to anyone who has felt life reduced to not yet or still not. Two men in an empty landscape waiting for a figure who may bring change or may never arrive at all. This play transforms the historically specific experience of war, of occupation, of land, of resistance into a universal condition. Beckett's artistic turning point came after the war in what he himself describes as a revelation during a visit to his mother in Dublin. He realized he could not continue in Joyce's footsteps. He could not continue writing in Joyce's style. He did not want it to be encyclopedic or heroic with language. And he realized that his subject matter was failure, ignorance, and impotence of the modern world and the modern man. Therefore, he turned towards the themes of failure, uncertainty, limitation, and towards those small defeated voices that we find are closer in spirit to Kafka's anti-heroes or to the hollow men of Iliad rather than the triumphant artist of Joyce's portrait of a young man. His famous line from a text that he later published was, "Ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better." This captures this ethic of persisting within failure rather than overcoming it. That sentence can almost stand as a comment on Vladimir and Estragon, who decide every evening to leave and every morning to come back and wait again, repeating the same pattern. Nothing improves, yet they continue. Their waiting becomes a kind of failing better, a stubborn, sometimes comic, sometimes tragic persistence in the face of meaninglessness. Crucially, Beckett chose to write Waiting for Godot first in French and then translate it into English himself. Writing in a second language forced him to simplify, to strip away ornamental phrasing, and to construct dialogues out of short repetitive exchanges. The sentence became shorter, the vocabulary more limited, the repetitions more noticeable. This process is almost the reverse of Joyce's multilingual exuberance in Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake, where Joyce multiplies language to expand meaning. Beckett reduces language to expose how little it can truly guarantee. Where earlier modernists like Joyce or Eliot use allusions and linguistic richness to express the crisis of modern life, Beckett uses reduction. The result is a play where simple words carry an immense philosophical weight. The famous line, "nothing to be done," is almost shockingly simple, but behind that simplicity lies the whole philosophical weight of modern literature, the sense of exhaustion, of being stuck, of not knowing what meaningful action would even look like. Beckett's experience in the Resistance also left its imprint on the form of the play. Resistance work involved codes, passwords, careful evasions, and an ever present fear behind ordinary action. Something similar happens in Waiting for Godot. The characters' speech is full of evasions, half truths, and circular talk. Their routines look comic on the surface, but feel like rituals to fill the dangerous silence underneath. One critic has even likened their odd, code like talk to the way underground groups communicated under occupation. In that sense, the play stands at an intersection between existential philosophy and the historical trauma, between Sartrean nausea and the very concrete experience of being hunted, displaced, and forced to wait. At the same time as writing Waiting for Godot, Beckett was also writing his trilogy of novels, Molloy, Malone Dice, The Unnameable. These books follow narrators whose identities are unstable, whose stories keep collapsing into repetition, and whose speech seems compelled simply to go on because there is nothing else to do. Vladimir and Estragon are stage versions of those narrators, figures who survive not by heroic action, but by talking, joking, quarreling, and remembering scraps of stories. Not because these stories lead anywhere, but because talking is the only way they can keep the void away. Here, the intertext is less about quotation and more about a shared inner landscape. What happens to the narrative once history has stripped away grand plots? Beckett's theatre, often grouped as the theatre of the absurd, is essentially absurd not because the play is silly or ridiculous, but because traditional structures, that is, the plot, backstory, clear motivation, all of this is stripped away. There is a deliberate refusal of conventional plot and psychological backstory. Instead of a clear psychological explanation, we get gestures, routines, and contradictions. And instead of a meaningful resolution, the play ends where it began, with two men deciding once again not to move. Beckett's own life, marked by war, exile, random violence, and deep introspection, gives us a moment for this aesthetic choice. After such experiences, a neat, well made plot might feel dishonest. This play speaks to survivors of war, to people living under dictatorships, to those facing personal crisis, and also even to students facing a more ordinary kind of waiting, like waiting for results, for jobs, or for clarity about their lives. That is why Beckett continues to matter. His life does not solve the riddle of Godot, but it helps us to see that the play is not a cold intellectual exercise. It is rooted in lived experiences of fear, of exile, failure, and endurance. So when we watch Vladimir and Estragon standing by that bare, lonely tree, we are not just meeting two tramps in an abstract philosophical experiment. We are encountering the distilled, personal experiences of a writer who has stood in hospital after a random stabbing, worked in secret against a violent regime, fled across a country, waited for liberation, and then chosen, quite consciously, to abandon literary grandeur in favor of two men who simply go on talking. Beckett's life does not explain Waiting for Godot, but it does tune our ears. We begin to hear that under the jokes and the repetition. The play is asking a very human question. After everything, how do we keep going? And what does it mean to wait?